A white war veteran rejects the black nurse sent to care for him until her quiet strength begins to unearth a past he thought was buried. She came from Ghana to heal his failing body, but her presence stirs ghosts he had spent decades trying. Tuforja Talera had always believed in the quiet dignity of a good goodbye. In Accra, Ghana, she was the one families called when the end was near. She didn't just care for the dying, she honored them. Brushing the hair of a grandfather who no longer remembered his name, singing softly to a mother who couldn't speak anymore, sitting in silence with a widow whose lungs were slowly giving up. Her care wasn't just medical, it was sacred. A bridge between this life and whatever waited after. But Talera wanted more than to serve just her corner of the world. She wanted to go where others didn't, where kindness had to stretch further. So when she came across a U.S.-based caregiver program seeking international nurses for in-home hospice patients, something in her stirred. It wasn't the money, it never had been. It was the idea of standing beside someone whose family was gone, of being the last warm hand they'd ever feel. That mattered. The process was long. Paperwork, interviews, cultural prep classes. She jumped every hurdle with the quiet resilience of someone who'd spent her whole life tending to others. Before herself, she passed every exam, cleared every background check, and eventually, her placement came through her assignment. A man named Walter Griggs, rural Idaho, a Korean War veteran with no children, no siblings, no spouse, just a diagnosis: pancreatic cancer, stage 4, in a lonely house up near the hills. Talera sat in her tiny room in Accra reading the file. No visitors expected, no hospice on site, just her and Walter and time. She closed the folder and whispered a prayer. Not for herself, but for him. She prayed she would be enough, that she could bring peace to a man facing the edge alone. Her church gathered around her on the Sunday before her flight. They wrapped her in white cloth and sang over her. The pastor laid hands on her and said, "You are sent, not just to heal, but to witness. Remember that." Her mother cried. Her brother smiled through the pain, and her best friend pressed a cross into her palm and said, "You're chosen." The flight to the U.S. was long, but Talera sat still and calm. Her mind drifted to Walter. What did he look like? Was he bitter? Was he afraid? Did he miss someone? She rehearsed what she'd say when she met him. "I'm here for you. I'm not afraid of your pain. You're not alone." When she landed at JFK, she waited 6 hours before boarding her next flight. She sat near gate B42, eating the sandwich she'd packed from home, when her phone buzzed. One new email. No subject line, no sender name, just 10 words. "Don't go to Walter's home. He's not what they told you." Talera froze. She stared at the message. She read it again and again. She looked around. No one was watching her. The airport bustled, with strangers and intercoms and crying babies. But to Talera, everything went quiet. Who sent it? And why? She clicked reply, but the address was blocked. No way to trace it. A chill ran through her. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. Was it a prank? A scam? Or something worse? She thought about calling the agency, but what would she say? That an anonymous message told her not to go? She closed the email, locked her phone, tried to shake the feeling. People fear what they don't understand. She reminded herself, "You've been here before." Back in nursing school, a patient's family refused to let her touch their mother. Sighed they didn't want foreign hands on American skin. Talera had smiled and stayed, because the dying woman had held her hand and cried, "Thank you." She knew hate, but she believed it could be softened by love still. Something about the message haunted her. As she boarded the next flight to Boise, her steps were slower. She kept thinking, what if it wasn't a warning about danger? What if it was a warning about truth? She landed in Idaho just after dusk. The sky stretched wide, pink and gold at the edges. The air was thin and quiet. The taxi driver barely spoke. He dropped her off in front of a motel with peeling paint and a blinking sign. She checked in and stared at the map on her phone. Walter's house was 26 minutes away, a straight shot down a lonely road lined with pine trees and silence. She sat on the bed and opened his file again. Walter Griggs, age 84, retired mechanic. Honorably discharged, decorated with medals, no visitors, no pets, no children. Do not resuscitate order, signed and notarized, 2 weeks. Maybe 3. There was a picture paper clipped to the back. Faded, a younger man with sharp eyes, a square jaw, and a tight-lipped frown. That was the man she'd come to help. She studied his face, tried to read something in his expression. Was he angry, tired, or simply a man who'd forgotten how to smile? She set the photo down and whispered to herself, "You've come this far." Outside, the wind picked up. The motel sign flickered, buzzing faintly in the night. And inside, Elera lay awake, wondering what kind of man she would meet in the morning. She still believed in kindness, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure it would be enough. The town looked like time had forgotten it. The buildings stood close together, like old friends with nothing new to say, their paint peeled in thin, tired layers. The only cafe was closed. The gas station flickered with a buzzing neon sign that seemed more annoyed than welcoming. And the people, they didn't say much when Elera stepped off the last bus and pulled her suitcase behind her. She noticed the way heads turned, but not in curiosity. It was something colder, something silent. Some stared, others looked down. One man crossed the street entirely. It wasn't loud. It didn't need debate. Quiet said it all. Still, she pressed forward. She had Walter's address. Her shoes crunched over gravel. Her coat too thin for the chill pressed tightly against her frame. Her hands, gloved but cold, held her documents close. This wasn't her first time in a place that didn't know what to make of her, but this was the first time she felt it in her bones. She walked up a long dirt driveway where the trees leaned in, as if they, too, were waiting to see how this would go. The house came into view, a single level, wood-paneled structure with faded green trim. A porch swing hung from one side. Motionless, Elera checked the address again. She stood tall, took a breath, and knocked a shuffly pause. Then the door creaked open, and there he was, Walter Griggs, thinner. Then the photo paler, his skin sagged under his eyes, and the fire that once made him look stern now just looked tired. But his stare, it still held something sharp. He looked at her head to toe. His jaw tightened. Then he spoke. "They sent me a maid," he said flatly. "I asked for a nurse, not some African girl." And with that he slammed the door. No hesitation, no chance to speak, just the sound of a deadbolt sliding into place. Elera stood there, the wind tugging gently at the hem of her skirt. She didn't cry. She didn't knock again. She simply turned around, picked up her suitcase, and walked back to the road. That night she stayed at the same small motel. Same blinking sign, same hum of silence. She sat on the bed, staring at her hands. They looked tired. She hadn't even unpacked. The agency called her around 9 p.m. The woman on the phone apologized, insisted this kind of thing wasn't common, begged her to try again. "He's just scared." They said, "He's sick. He doesn't mean it." But Elera knew better. Sickness doesn't invent prejudice. It only reveals what's already been hiding. Still, she agreed to return the next day, not because of what the agency said, but because of what she believed. He was a man dying alone, and she was still a nurse. So she went back this time. The door opened slower. He didn't say anything, just nodded once, as if to say, "Fine, let's get this over with." She stepped inside. The air smelled stale. The floors creaked. Dust floated in the sunlight like ash. The house was quiet, too quiet. There were no photos on the walls, no laughter left behind, just space, empty. And waiting Walter said nothing as she set down her bag. He motioned toward the guest room without turning around. That day, he refused his medication. He waved off every suggestion at lunch. He left his food untouched and said, "Must be nice, coming here for charity work. Bet it makes you feel good." Elera kept her voice steady. "I'm here because I was assigned to care for you," she said. He didn't look at her that night. He coughed until his chest shook, but he refused a humidifier. He refused help to the bathroom. He just sat in his recliner, eyes fixed on some faraway spot, while the clock ticked on. Elera documented everything, every word, every refusal, every insult. Her notes were neat, factual, without emotion, but inside she felt the weight of it. not the hate she'd faced. That before, no. What weighed her down was the silence beneath it. There was something else in Walter Griggs. Something buried. 3 days passed. Then 4. His pattern stayed the same. Cold in the morning, dismissive at night. His dog long gone, his fridge almost empty. His life smaller than the house that held it on the 5th day. Elora went to clean the guest room. She dusted the bookshelf, changed the sheets, opened the closet. At the very back, hidden behind an old coat, she saw it a wooden box. Locked, covered in years of dust. She pulled it out gently. It was heavier than expected. The metal latch rusted over. There were faint initials carved into the wood. She hesitated, then slipped it into the linen drawer. She'd asked before opening it, but later that evening, when Walter dozed off in his chair, mumbling to himself, she took the chance. She pried the latch open with the edge of a spoon. The lock gave with a soft pop. Inside, yellowed papers, old letters, folded clippings. A torn photo. One headline caught her eye. Black Sergeant saves unit in ambush wounded in action. There was a picture. A young black man, standing tall, serious, decorated in full uniform. Beneath it, a caption. Sergeant Samuel J. Daniels, 1963. Next, the photo black and white, torn across the middle. On one side, Walter, young in uniform. On the other, a black woman, half smiling. Her hand rested gently on his arm. Torn edge split them perfectly in two. Elora held the picture between her fingers. Something was missing. No, not missing. Hidden. She closed the box, placed it back, and returned to the kitchen to make tea. Walter was still asleep, murmuring softly into the dark. She couldn't hear the words, but she could feel it. The past was closer than it looked. The days passed like pages in a book no one had finished reading each morning. Elora woke before the sun, wrapped in silence and the cold hum of an unfamiliar place. She swept, scrubbed, disinfected, wiped. It wasn't about the dust, it was about the distance. If she couldn't reach Walter with her voice, maybe she could reach him with care. The house began to change, ever so slightly. The stale air lifted. The kitchen, once lined with old stains and forgotten cans, started to feel lived in. The light in the living room fell across clean windows now. She washed his blankets, folded his socks, wiped cobwebs from corners no one had touched in years. One afternoon, while moving a rug near the hallway vent, her foot caught on something raised in the floorboard. She knelt down, ran her fingers across the wood. Something was loose. She pried gently at the edges and pulled the plank free. Inside, the hollow space beneath it, a velvet pouch tied with a fraying ribbon, brittle notes folded over themselves, and a row of medals, shiny but aged, tucked deep into the silence of time. Purple Heart, Bronze Star, Distinguished Service Cross. Elora held each one in her hands, as if they might still remember where they came from. She sat on the floor for a long time, reading faded writing on yellowed slips of paper. A few were love notes, short, signed with an S. Others were typed military reports. One held a name she hadn't seen before, S.J. Daniels. She recognized it from the newspaper clipping. The black soldier in the photo, the one in Walter's secret bunk. She wanted to ask questions, but every time she tried, Walter shut the door, literally, figuratively, until the dog showed up. It happened one morning just before sunrise. Elora heard scratching at the back door. She opened it slowly and saw an old, large dog brown coat dusted with white around the eyes and snout. He looked tired, like he knew the road well, and yet, the moment he saw her, his tail wagged just once. She fed him scraps of chicken and set out a bowl of water. He stayed. Walter grumbled when he saw the dog on the porch. "You came back?" he muttered. "I thought you were dead." Elora looked at him. "You know him?" she asked quietly. Walter nodded, but didn't answer, so Elora named him Rufus every day. Rufus waited for her by the garden, sat beside her while she read medical logs, rested near her feet when she peeled potatoes in the kitchen. He was quiet, loyal, and full of stories she wished he could tell, and something changed. Walter started watching her more. He didn't speak. Not at first, but he looked longer. He didn't stop her from entering rooms anymore. He let her sweep past his chair without groaning. One night, He even ate half of the stew she made, without complaint. Then the murmurs began. It started softly. In the darkness of the hallway, Alara had been putting away towels when she heard it. A whisper from the recliner, "Sarah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it." She froze. There it was again, clearer this time. "Sarah, come back." The next night, she heard more, words tangled in regret, names spoken like prayers, pleas folded into sleep. The third night, she sat beside him quietly, notebook in hand. He didn't stir, but his voice broke through the silence again. "Sarah, I swear, I didn't want to. They made me. I didn't want to." In the morning, she brewed tea and placed a cup near his chair. She sat down slowly, cleared her throat, and asked gently, "Who was Sarah?" His body tensed, shoulders stiffened, his jaw tightened like it wanted to lock the words in. "You don't ask me about her." He snapped, his eyes red, filled with something deeper than anger, met hers. "You stay out of my business and stay the hell out of my room." Then he stood, limped away, slamming the bedroom door behind him. She didn't follow. Instead, she went to the porch. Rufus followed her. She sat with her hands wrapped around her tea, looking out at the trees. The world didn't pause for pain. It just kept turning. Later that day, someone knocked on the door. It was an older woman, hair pinned up, eyes kind but sharp, arms full of groceries. "June," she introduced herself. "Walter's neighbor, used to check in more often, but, well, you know how he is." Alara smiled politely. June handed her the bags, and as she turned to leave, she paused. Then she leaned in and said something soft, low, like a secret that had waited too long. "He doesn't hate you, dear." Alara looked up. "He hates himself." June stepped back, adjusted her coat. "He loved a woman once, long time ago, early 60s. She was black. Her name was Sarah. Smart. Beautiful. Used to sing at the cafe in town before they shut it down. That woman changed him, softened him. I saw it with my own eyes." Alara didn't speak. June continued. "But his family, you know how things were back then. They gave him a choice. Her or them." Her voice broke, just slightly. "He chose them." She glanced at the house, then back at Alara. "Hasn't been right since June walked down the steps." Her words hanging in the air like unfinished sentences. Alara stood still, and for the first time the pieces began to connect. Walter's silence, the medals hidden beneath the floor, the torn photo, the sleep murmurs, the name Sarah. She looked back at the door. The man inside hadn't let her in fully, but he had once let someone else in. Someone who looked like her. Someone who loved him and was left behind. Alara wasn't the first black woman in that house, but she might be the last, and now she knew she was walking through someone else's memory, and that memory still had something to say. By the end of the second week, Walter had changed. Not soft, not exactly, but his fire had dimmed. His words came slower. His hands trembled more. He no longer rose from his recliner without effort. His shoulders hunched as if carrying the invisible weight of something that wouldn't go away, something heavier than illness. Alara noticed it in the little things, the untouched meals, the stack of unopened mail, the way he stared at the photo she had found, now quietly resting on his knitstand, the torn picture of him and the black woman named Sarah. He never said her name out loud again, but at night his murmurs still came, sometimes with regret, sometimes like prayer, and sometimes with a kind of sorrow that didn't need language. Then the agency called. They needed a local nurse to come and certify his condition for hospice enrollment. Walter's vitals had declined rapidly. The change was sharp, sudden. His organs were slowing. His body was folding inward. Alara knew what that meant. She prepared his records, cleaned the house, set out fresh towels. She wanted the visit to be smooth for Walter's sake, for her own, for the dignity of the work. June arrived first, carrying a pie. She always brought something when she came. Something warm, something homemade, something that tried to say what words couldn't. A few minutes later, the nurse arrived, middle-aged, short hair, clipboard in hand, professional, but kind-eyed. She nodded toward Alara, introduced herself as Ms. Holland, then turned toward Walter, seated in his recliner with a blanket draped across his legs. The visit began quietly. Ms. Holland checked his pulse, asked a few questions. documented his responses. Elora stood nearby, ready if needed. She had his files, his medications, his most recent symptoms. She had cared for him every day, tracked everything in detail, stayed through the worst of his coughing spells and restless nights. But Walter said nothing about her. He barely acknowledged her at all. Then came the moment. Holland turned and asked softly, "Is this your caregiver? Should she remain on the case as your hospice nurse?" Walter looked at Elora long and slow, then his voice came out, rough as gravel, quiet but sharp enough to cut through everything. "She doesn't belong here," he said. "Get her out of my house." The room froze. Elora felt her throat tighten, but she didn't speak. She didn't blink. She just stood still, holding the folder against her chest. Mens Holland looked uncertain, glanced at June, then back at Walter. "She's been here, hasn't she?" she asked gently. "Caring for you?" "She doesn't belong here," Walter repeated, louder this time. "I don't want her here, not her." The silence that followed felt too loud. June opened her mouth, then closed it again. Mens Holland shifted her stance, scribbled something on her clipboard. "Well," she said slowly, "if the patient formally requests it, we can notify the agency. They'll reassign the case. I'll make a note and—" But Elora was already walking. She didn't slam the door, didn't drop the file, didn't raise her voice. She simply stepped outside. The cold air hit her cheeks, and for a moment she thought she might finally cry. But the tears didn't come. Instead, she pulled something from her pocket, a flash drive. Inside it, a dozen audio recordings. Walter's voice, captured over sleepless nights, regret soaked in half-conscious murmurs, names whispered like sins. "Please, spoken to no one. Sarah, I'm sorry. I should have gone after you. They gave me medals, but I lost my soul." Elora walked back in, her shoes quiet against the floor. She set the flash drive beside his chair, and next to it, she placed a letter, handwritten, folded once. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't owe him one. She returned to the motel, the same one with the flickering sign and threadbare sheets. She laid on the bed, fully dressed, her arms across her stomach, staring at the ceiling like it might offer answers. The next day, she got a call from the agency. They told her Walter had stopped eating, refused water, refused help, refused to speak. They asked if she could come back to Idaho for a brief check-in, maybe even say a final prayer. If she was willing, Elora said no. They paused, then they added, "Walter asked for you by name." The words sat in her ear like an echo. She didn't respond right away, didn't promise anything. But that night, she packed her bag again, not because she'd forgiven him, not because she needed closure, but because sometimes mercy isn't about who deserves it. It's about who's left. When she walked into the house, it smelled the same, old wood and stale breath. But Walter was different, smaller, paler. His eyes, once sharp, now flickered like a flame running out of oxygen. He looked up at her from the bed, and for the first time, his voice cracked. "You came back." Elora didn't answer. She pulled off her coat, rolled up her sleeves, and, without a word, she began to care for him again. She held his hand as he trembled, placed ice chips on his lips when he couldn't swallow, sat beside him as the hours passed, like sand falling through glass. There was no apology, no speech, no dramatic moment of reconciliation, just silence and her presence. That night, as he slept, she read the letter she'd left beside his chair days before. It was still folded, unopened. She opened it herself and read it aloud. "I don't forgive you for who you were, but I choose to care for the man you've become, because someone once chose to care for me. Not because I earned it, but because love isn't always fair. Sometimes it just shows up, and this time it showed up in the form of a nurse from Ghana. Her name is Elora, and she was never just a caregiver. She was your mirror." She folded the letter again and tucked it beneath his hand. The wind outside rattled the windows softly, as if the house itself was finally beginning to exhale. The house had grown quieter than usual. Even the creaking of the old wooden floors seemed more careful now, as though the walls themselves were listening. Outside, the wind bent through the trees, brushing against the windows like an old friend. Too hesitant to knock inside, Walter lay in the bed he once refused to use. His body, once rigid and full of resistance, now softened into the sheets. His breath was shallow, more whisper than sound. His eyes, once stormy, were just tired. But there was something else there too. Regret doesn't always come loud. Sometimes it slips in like dusk, slowly, quietly. And before you know it, it's everywhere. Lara sat beside him again, no longer in scrubs, no longer trying to fix what couldn't be fixed, just present. Her face calm, her movements precise. She no longer filled the silence with instructions or comfort. She let it sit between them like smoke, something that couldn't be ignored. Any more than, for the first time in days, Walter spoke, his voice cracked, dry and uncertain, as if the words themselves weighed too much. Sarah was pregnant. Elora didn't move. Her hands were still in her lap. He swallowed, his gaze fixed somewhere far past the ceiling. My parents? Found out, he continued. They made her leave, took care of everything before I even knew what was happening. They said it would ruin the family name. I was just 19, he coughed, but waved off the water. I never saw her again, never met my son. The words fell between them like stones. For a long time, Elora said nothing. She stared at her hands, her fingers curled gently together, her eyes unreadable. Then she looked up, steady, almost kind, but clear as glass. That wasn't your last chance, she said softly. Her voice didn't rise, didn't accuse. You've had many, and you still chose hate. Walter's mouth trembled, but no words came, just a quiet breath, a blink, then another. She leaned forward. You could have chosen better, she said, almost in a whisper. When you joined the force, when you saw families that looked like mine, when you opened your door to people like me, not once, but again and again, and pushed them out. You had chances, you buried them. He didn't argue. There was no fight left in him, only truth, only time he couldn't get back, and shame, the kind that doesn't sting, it settles. It lives in the bones, a silent companion. But, Elora added, standing up slowly, I'm not here to rewrite your story. She moved toward the window, her back to him. I'm not here to save you. I'm not your redemption. I won't pretend your apology is enough. She turned. Her expression was calm, but there was something fierce behind her eyes. I'm here because you're dying, and because even now, no one deserves to be left in fear. Not even you. He nodded once barely. She picked up a cloth, adjusted his blanket, checked the drip. She moved the way nurses do when the work is no longer about healing, but comfort. Her presence filled the room, not with warmth, but with quiet strength. Walter didn't speak again that day, but he didn't have to. Sometimes silence says more than confession ever could. And so, the days passed, simple, wordless, but not empty. There were no long conversations, no grand goodbyes. Just moments, a hand resting on his shoulder during the night, a sip of water brought with care. A story Elora told quietly about her grandmother in Ghana, who lived to be 96 and believed that the dead could still hear the living if the living spoke with honesty. Walter didn't ask her to speak to his son. He didn't beg for a second chance, because deep down, he knew that some chances don't come again. Some doors, once closed, stay that way. But each day that Elora stayed, something shifted. Not forgiveness, not friendship, but understanding. A space where truth could sit and be acknowledged, without being excused. One evening, as the sun dropped below the trees and lit the room with a soft, orange glow, Walter looked up at Elora. His mouth twitched like he wanted to speak, but he didn't. Instead, she reached for the photograph on his knit stand, the one of Sarah. She placed it on his chest, gently, and patted it twice. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in weeks, his breathing slowed, not from pain, but from peace, when he passed. 2 days later, it was quiet, no alarms, no gasps, just a long breath. And then none. Elora didn't cry. She closed his eyes, folded the blanket over his chest, sat by his side for several minutes before calling the agency. She wrote in the file, patient died peacefully. Final days were quiet, minimal distress. But that wasn't the full story. What she didn't write was this: that Walter James, once a soldier, once a cop, once a man who built walls around himself thick with pride and fear, died with a black woman by his side. not because he earned her presence, but because she gave it not as a healer, not as a symbol, but as a human being, one who understood that sometimes the greatest power you can carry is choosing to stay when the world expects you to walk away. And though she didn't offer him grace in words, she gave him something just as rare, truth, and in the end, that was more than he'd ever asked for. Sometimes the biggest truths arrive after the story ends quietly, like a letter that shows up weeks too late. No knock, no warning, just the sound of paper unfolding. Walter had been gone for only 3 days when the call came from the attorney. The will was to be read at his house, his home, now silent and sunlit, with Illyra sitting on the same couch where she had once folded towels, poured soup, listened to his breathing through the night. She didn't expect much. A final invoice, maybe a signature on a release form. She wasn't family. She was the nurse, the one who stayed longer than she should have. But when the attorney opened the file and began to read, his voice slowed to Illyra Sarah Boateng. He said, adjusting his glasses, Walter's words, typed, signed, witnessed, I leave this house. I leave what remains of it, because it belonged to the past, and she is the only part of that past that stayed. There was a pause. Illyra blinked. Sarah? She repeated. Her voice barely left her throat. He said, Sarah? The attorney nodded. That's your legal middle name, isn't it? Illyra didn't answer. Her chest tightened. She looked around the room at the photos still on the shelves, the coat still hanging on the rack, and suddenly, the air felt heavier than it had all week. She had never told him her full name. Never once. She had filled out forms. Yes, but just the basics. No reason to mention the name passed down by her mother, a name given in honor of a woman who died long before. Illyra was born her grandmother Sarah Nyamiki Boateng. She hadn't spoken about her in this house. She hadn't needed to, but now something clicked. That night, long after the lawyer had gone, she wandered through the house alone. Each room looked different now, not just with the furniture gone, but with the silence that comes after someone has left for good. And in his bedroom, in the drawer by the bed, beneath a folded shirt, she found it a photograph, old, faded, the edges curled. A young Ghanaian woman stood barefoot on red soil, holding a baby against her chest. The woman was beautiful, sharp cheekbones, confident eyes, a quiet pride, and her smile. Illyra had seen that smile in 100 family photos, in the mirror, in her mother's old albums. It was her grandmother and the child, a baby boy on the back of the photograph, and handwriting that had softened with age. It read, Sarah Kumasi, 1965. Illyra sat on the bed. The photo trembled in her hands. She'd never known much about her grandmother's early life. The family had told stories, but they were always vague, wrapped in warnings and silences. Her mother would say things like, Sarah had a complicated past, or your grandma loved someone once, but she lost him before she came back home. Now the pieces began fitting together. The man who pushed her away, the name he whispered in his sleep, the anger he clung to for decades. What if the reason Walter kept pushing wasn't only because she reminded him of something he hated, but because she reminded him of someone he loved and lost? What if that house, that hospice bed, that cold front door, had been the last barrier between a man and the truth he couldn't face? What if she was his truth? She sent the photo to her mother. A phone call later, her mother was weeping. That's my mother. That's me. Illyra, that baby. That's me. The silence between them was long, full. Nothing needed to be added. It took weeks to process, months even, but eventually. Illyra ordered the DNA test, not because she needed proof, but because the world would. It came back with confirmed paternity. Walter Gregg's former cop, former husband, former man of silence was her grandfather. He had rejected her the way he had rejected so many others, but this time it was different, because this time it had come full circle. The media got wind of the story. A nurse inherits her patient's house, turns out to be his granddaughter. Had made headlines, not because of the will, but because of what it meant. People debated online. They fought in comment sections. Some called it fate. Others called it justice. But Elira didn't join the conversation. She stayed in the house painted. The walls repaired the porch, hung new curtains in the bedroom where he'd once cursed her name, and above the mantel, in a wooden frame, she placed the photograph, her grandmother, barefoot in the red dust, holding the child who'd grow to become the man who never knew what it meant to hold on to love, and under it, a small plaque that read, "From what was hidden, something was still passed on." She didn't forgive Walter, she didn't have to, but she acknowledged him, and that, in the end, was enough. Elira was never just a nurse, she was a mirror, a quiet reflection of everything Walter refused to face. His choices, his silence, his regrets. She showed up with medicine in one hand, and grace in the other. She didn't yell, she didn't fight him, she simply stayed, and in doing so, she peeled back decades of shame. She helped a man who had buried the truth bury his pain instead, and somehow, without even trying, she uncovered the hidden wounds of a generation. Not with lectures, not with revenge, but with presence. She gave Walter something he never gave, himself permission to feel what he'd locked away, and by the time he was gone, the story wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the echo he left behind. It was about the granddaughter who turned a house of anger into a home of healing. It was about a legacy rewritten, not erased.